Okay, this is podcast 49 on the circulatory system in animals. And it's just going to be kind of a quick overview, highlighting some of the major things you might see on the AP exam. So let's get right to it. Okay, obvious something you ought to be aware of is that the function of a circulatory system is simply to move things around your body. That's the definition of circulation. Things are moving around. Now, what things need to be moved around an animal body, those should be reasonably obvious to you, I would hope. Hold on. There we go. Oxygen. First things you should think of are oxygen and CO2 because we talk about the circulatory system a whole lot in conjunction with the respiratory system. But it also has a lot to do with digestion. The only way you can get nutrients where they need to go is to take them from the digestive system and take them to the tissues of the body where they're used. We have to get waste away from the tissues and to the kidneys. But usually these two ideas get kind of shortchanged in favor of oxygen and paying attention to oxygen and CO2. Okay? Now, if you're a one-celled critter, a single-celled organism, you're not an animal, which kind of leaves you out of the animal part of this discussion, but all you need to move things around your body is diffusion. The end. You don't need a big system because you're not a big critter, okay? Diffusion's good enough. But if you want to gain size, if you want to be a big organism, a complex organism, an organism that has a lot of complex, high energy activities, then you need a system that is going to be more efficient. Please remember the plants. If you're a moss, you're going to be little because all you have is osmosis and diffusion to get nutrients from one place to another. You don't have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, to efficiently move materials up and down a big body. It's the same principle here with animals. Little animals don't need a system, big animals do. Okay? Now, circulation in different animal phyla. If you are talking sponges, and think back to our animal chart, our starting with sponges and moving on down into greater levels of complexity. Sponges, diffusion, the end. Okay? They use diffusion. They have no system. Each cell is doing its own deal with circulation. Okay? Now, in the next phyla up on the chain, Cnidaria and Platyhelminthes. Okay, here are our Cnidarians, and here's our Platyhelminthes, or our flatworm. So our jellyfish and flatworms are going to use something called a gastrovascular cavity. If you'll recall, we've talked about before how jellyfish, for example, have one opening and food goes in and any undigested food would go back out. Well, this opening is to a chamber called a gastrodigestive vascular circulatory cavity. Essentially, it's a dead end. Food's digested here, but it is also distributed once it's digested across the body wall, and the same goes here. It's just that the gastrovascular cavity has got a little bit more complexity in that it branches, whereas this one does not. It's not really a system, so to speak, but it's better at distributing nutrients than diffusion all by itself. So the gastrovascular cavity is a little step up, not a big step up, and it's found in the jellyfish and the flatworms. Okay? Next, comes a discussion of true circulatory systems, where we actually see organs and blood and things like that. And the things you need to remember that true circulatory systems have in common is movements of material, large amounts of material due to bulk flow, just like we talked about with the plants. Differences in pressure are going to be driving the movement of large amounts of material. This time, however, that pressure is not caused by cohesion, by water leaving the plant or whatever like that. It's caused by the beating heart. So we're talking about a positive pressure idea. Okay, there are two types of true circulatory systems. There is an open and a closed. Okay, both open and closed circulatory systems, remember these are both true systems, have some things very much in common. They both have some type of fluid that is going to be circulating. We'll call it blood for now. Some type of tubes that carry blood around the body, and they have some kind of muscular pump or a heart. Okay, those are all in common. Now, how they differ is in the type of blood. For example, in an open system, we would call the blood is really a mixture of true blood and the body fluids that are out amongst the tissues. It's a mix. These are not separated. These are together in an open circulatory system, and that combination fluid is called hemolymph. Hemo for the blood, lymph for the body fluid. In a closed system, the blood is always kept separate from the body fluids. The blood is always contained within blood vessels. It never leaves the blood vessels to mix with body fluids. Okay? Speaking of blood vessels, in an open system, as you might guess, given the mixing that the blood does, the blood vessels are incomplete. They start, if this is my heart, let's say this round sac is my heart, and these are blood vessels coming out of the side of the heart. That's it. That's as far as they go. So the heart would pump, blood would go out, and then it would be just squishing around in the body fluids, and then when the heart relaxed, all the blood and body fluid could go back into the heart. Okay, nice sound effects. Yes. Okay, so in a closed system, by contrast, if this is my heart here and this is my heart here, so we've got this big sac, the blood vessels are completely closed off to the outside environment. So when my heart pumps closed, or squeezes rather, blood goes out and it stays contained in the blood vessels, okay, and it is actually going to move in one direction back into the heart like that. It is always contained in blood vessels. It never ever leaves, okay, to go mix with the body fluids. And of course there are there are many types of hearts, depending on which type of critter you're talking about, and some have more than one chamber, and we'll talk about that. So in phylum Arthropoda, the crustaceans and the insects, and phylum Mollusca, in particular in the gastropods, the snails, etc., and the bivalves. Okay, we're going to see the cephalopods are a bit different. We have an open system. Okay, and what we see is we have a heart. Now you can see, I'm not sure if you can see, that the heart is this really bizarrely elongated structure running along the body, and these partial blood vessels that extend a short distance from the heart. Okay, and here we see the partial blood vessels here and here and here, and this would just be the organs and the body fluid and so on. And so the heart beats, the fluid goes out and bathes around, and then it goes back into the heart. Okay, what could possibly be the advantage to this? It's not as efficient as a closed system, but it's not as costly to operate. The pressures are lower. It doesn't take as much energy to move the blood. There are fewer blood vessels, so it takes less energy to build it. So there are advantages to this. It's not so much of an investment, but you still get some circulation. Okay, now closed system. Okay, so in this frame we're dealing with a closed circulatory system. We find it in a few invertebrates, the annelids, the earthworms, segmented worms, for example, and the cephalopods like the squid and octopus from phylum Mollusca have closed systems, and all vertebrates, meaning you and birds and reptiles and fish, all have a closed system. So again, we're going to see a heart, but more importantly, we're going to see complete blood vessels, okay? Which means here is my heart, my blood will be pumped, it's going to move, it's going to move, it's going to move, it's going to stay in blood vessels. These blood vessels may get smaller, as you can see, but it's going to stay, and then the blood will be returned to the heart without ever having left the blood vessels, okay? It does require the presence of really, really tiny blood vessels that we call capillaries, because since the blood is contained in vessels, we have to get it down to a blood vessel size where the walls of the vessel are so thin that oxygen could actually just diffuse. The oxygen gas can diffuse out into the tissues directly from the capillaries here, and CO2 can diffuse in so that we can get that transfer of gases and other materials. So we'll talk more about capillaries in a minute, but we never ever get body fluid going in here, and we never get blood actually leaving. We just get diffusion of gases or nutrients across the thin capillary walls. Alright, speaking of vertebrates and their closed circulatory systems, we need to talk a little bit about the different types of circulation we see in different vertebrates, and we are talking about first fish. Okay, fish, the first vertebrates, have a reasonably simple, though much more advanced than anything that came before them, two-chambered heart. What that means is they have one atrium, which you see here, and one ventricle. What does that mean? An atrium is the chamber in the heart that receives blood from something, in this case the body. So it receives blood from the body. The ventricle is normally more muscular because it is the pumping chamber. It is going to pump blood somewhere. Okay, so if we imagine that the blood systemic means essentially body, so the blood has been out in the body here. Here we see gills. Remember, fish breathe with gills, so this is the respiratory organs up here. Okay, so if we follow our arrows, let's pick it up here at the atrium of the heart. Blood will be out in the body, have been out in the body, and will come back into the atrium. If the blood has been in the body, it has given up all its oxygen to the body tissues, the muscles, the organs, the brain, whatever. It's given the oxygen up. It comes back deoxygenated. Okay, and then the blood passes into the ventricle. The ventricle is the pumping chamber. It pumps and it sends the blood to the gills. If you'll notice, the blood vessels subdivide and get smaller and smaller till we hit the capillaries, the tiny vessels that are in the gills, and then the oxygen from the gills will diffuse into the blood. Remember, the concentration of oxygen in the gills would be very high. It would be very low in the blood vessels because we're deoxygenated from having come back from the body and we used up all our oxygen, so the oxygen would readily flow in, and then the next thing you know, when we're coming out of the gills, the blood has a lot of oxygen, and that blood would move to the body where the oxygen is needed, give up that oxygen because the body would be fairly low on oxygen, so it would give it up out into the body tissues and take up CO2, and we'd return to the heart to do it all over again. Now, what you need to know is that when the blood leaves the heart and leaves this major vessel, and the vessel starts subdividing and getting smaller and smaller, Essentially what's happening, because we're splitting this into so many different capillary paths, it's as though we are widening the path the blood is flowing. Imagine having had your thumb over the end of a hose and the water's come out really hard and fast, and then imagine just moving your thumb away and making that hole wider. All of a sudden the water just goes, okay? Well, this is essentially what's happening to the heart, to the blood when it reaches a capillary bed, a place where there's lots of capillaries. The blood slows down. So the blood slows at capillary beds, places where there's lots of capillaries. And so it's gotten slow here. We go back out in a major blood vessel out to the body organs, the muscles, the brain, the stomach, wherever we might need some oxygen to fuel activities, and we get another bunch of capillary beds. So the blood's going to slow down again. Okay? So by the time we get back to the heart here, when you're a fish, your blood is moving so slow. It is only because you wiggle your fishy body that it actually gets shoved back into the heart where it belongs. Seriously. So it's a fine heart if you are a fish and you don't have a lot of high energy activities to do. You're fishy, you're floating in the water, the temperature in water is pretty constant, you're not dealing with a lot of extreme temperatures. Your two-chambered heart, not very efficient at speeding the blood along. It's okay, but it's not efficient enough if you want to live on land and do some high energy activities. So natural selection, as animals began to venture out onto land, natural selection began to favor a more well-adapted heart for that purpose. So summary on the fish heart: one pumping event, pump right here, one ventricle pump, but it's got to pass through two capillary beds, and the blood is going to slow at each one of those. Okay, so the blood slows down and it's very low pressure and it's very inefficient, comparatively speaking. If you're a fish, you're in good shape, it's good enough, it's fine. But if you want to live on land, we need something better. So the reptiles and amphibians, or I should say amphibians and reptiles, natural selection favored a third chamber. Okay? Essentially, let's follow the path. So the blood has been out in the systemic or body capillaries. It's deoxygenated. It comes back. It enters an atrium. In this case, the right atrium. It's the animal's right, not your right. The blood then passes into the ventricle. Okay? Well, we're going to pump the ventricle. The ventricle is always the pumping chamber. We're going to pump the ventricle, and the ventricle is going to send the blood up. Now, we're going to follow this path for now. You notice we've got another fork we could follow, but we're going to go up here. We're going to go to the pulmocutaneous. What this means, pulmo refers to lungs, cutaneous refers to skin. Remember, amphibians are using lungs and skin to breathe. Imagine a frog, for example. They do have lungs when they're adults, but they also have moist skin. They use it to get oxygen too. Now, we're going to go through this capillary bed. We're going to slow down, but we're going to pick up oxygen, and instead of trying to make it to the body, we're going to make a return trip to the heart. We're going to come into the left atrium, and we're going to drop in the ventricle. Boom! We're going to get a second blast of pressure. We're going to get a second pump, and that's going to make a huge difference. We are going to pump this oxygenated blood out, and that's going to go to the body at a much higher rate of speed than what was in the fish's heart because we got that second pump. We're going to give up the oxygen to the muscles and the stomach and the brain and anything that needs it, and then we'll send the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Now, did you see a drawback though? Right here, one ventricle means at some point we are going to be mixing oxygen poor blood with oxygen rich blood, and we are not going to get the most efficient blood flow we can because we're going to be mixing some of those two blood types, and it would be much more efficient if we could keep prevent our oxygen-rich blood from mixing with that oxygen-poor blood. Okay, so in this amphibian and reptile three-chambered heart, we have two pumping events that push us through two capillary beds, much more efficient. The blood is able to maintain its speed through these capillary beds because we got that extra pumping event. Okay, but our drawback is that it's mixed. We have the oxygenated and deoxygenated in one ventricle. In some reptiles there is almost a separation in that ventricle, but it's not quite complete. And I believe crocodiles and alligators that the separation is almost complete, not quite. All right, fourth chamber. We are going to add a fourth chamber rather when we get to mammals. Okay, so we are in the birds and the mammals. Both have four-chambered hearts. Okay, most efficient heart there is. Very much like the amphibian and reptile heart, but we're going to achieve complete separation. So again, oxygen poor blood into the right atrium, but now it will enter its very own separate right ventricle. Ventricle pumps, we're going to send this blood into the pulmonary. Pulmonary refers to just lungs. You do not breathe through your skin. So just to the lungs. We will pick up oxygen at the lungs. We're going to come back oxygen rich and enter the left atrium. We're going to dump into the left ventricle. Left ventricle pumps again. There's our second pumping event that's going to take us to our second capillary bed, and that's the one out in the body, to the muscles, to the brain, to the stomach. Wherever we need oxygen, oxygen will be given up, and we return oxygen poor blood back to the right atrium to do it again. Extremely efficient. The most efficient heart there is. High pressure and no mixing. The blood maintains speed. We do not mix the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So why is the four-chambered heart, why did natural selection favor that? Several reasons. Let's talk about those. Why would natural selection favor it? Well, at some point it seems apparent that natural selection was favoring an increase in body size. If you're bigger, you're less likely to get eaten. If you're an herbivore, you've got bigger stomach to take in all that very hard to digest plant material, so you can be working on digesting it. Natural selection also began to favor endothermy, and if you'll recall, that means, if we talk in very poor terms, warm-bloodedness. Okay, warm-bloodedness. Natural selection favored that because you could colonize more habitats if you're warm-blooded. You can go up and get in warm and cold climates, whereas if you're a lizard, you got to stay where it's warm, or else you just have to hibernate, which is not very going to lead you to a very complex lifestyle. Running and flight are both favored. They get you away from predators. They allow you to capture prey. All of these activities, the increase in body size, the favoring of endothermy, the running, and all of those are very energetically demanding activities. Natural selection would have favored changes in an organism that would have allowed enough energy for those activities to occur. And that efficient four-chambered heart allows for lots of oxygen, which means lots of working mitochondria, which means lots of ATP, which means lots of energy to do all these very costly activities. Okay? Okay. Oh, this is not a trivial thing. We need to note this little piece as well. Birds and mammals, one did not evolve from the other. One is not the ancestor of the other. This four-chambered heart that is evolved in both birds and mammals evolves separately in both of them. It is an example of convergent evolution, where they aren't particularly closely related, but they have this similar characteristic because of the way their environment was sculpting both of these branches, and they both got the same result, but that it was arose independently in both of them. That four-chambered heart arose independently. All right, so we've already talked about this. I should have had this slide first. An atrium is a chamber that receives blood. A ventricle is a chamber that pumps blood. This one is muscular because it's the pumping chamber. Blood vessels, arteries, always carry blood away from the heart. You need to associate arteries with away. Most of the time, they are carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart. But when they are sending blood to the lungs, they can be carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart and to the lungs to pick up oxygen when they get there. Now, we talked about a blood vessel. Here is a major artery, okay? But it's going to subdivide out. It's going to subdivide out, and it's going to get increasingly small. The blood vessels coming from it are getting increasingly small, because remember, we've got to get down to the size of those little tiny capillaries so that things can diffuse. So arterioles are arteries are pretty major. Arterioles are a little smaller, okay? Veins are blood vessels that are going to return blood to the heart, so veins are always carrying blood to the heart. Most of the time we will talk about deoxygenated blood, oxygen poor blood coming back to the heart, but again, not always. If the blood is coming back from the lungs, it will be quite oxygen rich. Venules are a little bit smaller than veins. Okay, and capillaries are the smallest of all. And if you need to know any of these, you should know capillaries. Capillaries have extremely thin walls, one cell layer thick. Why? So that gases and other materials can diffuse from within the capillary to the tissues outside the capillary. We are going to pass materials directly through the wall of the capillary by diffusion. Okay? A capillary bed is a network of capillaries. We've already talked about that. So arteries are big, sturdy blood vessels. They have lots of protective covering, a thick wall of muscle and a thin wall of epithelium lining them. Okay, arterioles would be a little smaller, and then you get to the capillaries, which are extremely thin, one cell thick. We just mentioned that. And then, so this is coming from the heart. So let's say the heart beats, and we have this oxygen-rich blood in the heart. It's going into major arteries. These will subdivide and further subdivide to the capillaries, where we will diffuse that oxygen out into the tissue that needs it. But we've got to get this blood that is now oxygen poor back to the heart. So now we're going to deliver this blood that's in capillaries into venules, which are slightly larger, and then into the veins, which are the largest. And if you'll notice, look how much muscle is around this artery. Much less muscle here. And we'll talk about that a bit in a minute. But this veins will ultimately deliver back into the heart. So veins are big, venules would be like here, and the capillaries are here. Here are arterioles, and here's a major artery. Okay? All right. Arteries are built for high pressure. The arteries, the heart pumps, boom, the blood is going out of the heart and away from the heart and into arteries. They have thick walls to provide strength, so they basically don't blow apart when they're receiving that high pressure from the heart. They are rather elastic, so they can give a little and bounce back. Additionally, that elastic recoil helps the pressure to remain constant even when the heart is not pumping. But this is the main thing, thicker muscular walls. Okay, and you can see that up here. Look at the artery and look at the vein in a cross section. Okay. Now what you're seeing in this diagram, here's a big wide artery. Here is an arteriole subdividing off of that major artery, and it's further subdividing into capillaries here. Once the blood has been in the capillaries, it will keep going this way and be picked up by venules and then sent into veins to go back into the heart. Here's a vein, again, thin-walled, wider diameter. We want it to be very easy for blood to flow in a vein because the pressure is less in the vein. It's moving slower in the veins. It's because they're usually, we're bringing the blood back to the heart from being very far away from the heart. Okay? Valves. There are structures, for example, in your legs. Your blood is having to come back to the heart up your leg against gravity. Why doesn't gravity pull it down? Well, it might, except for your muscles are working to keep the blood moving in the right direction, and there are valves. The blood will come up, and then the valves will be such that if the blood were to try to go backwards, the valves will shut and prevent backflow. So valves prevent backflow of blood. Okay, they prevent backflow of blood. All right, and so they would be associated with veins. Arteries wouldn't need that because they are pushing the blood on ahead, but veins need that protection against backflow. The blood flow is so much weaker in veins. Capillaries, very thin walls. We've already talked about that. Diffusion you need to associate with capillaries. Okay. Now, sometimes if you're doing something, you need to shut off blood flow to somewhere else and divert blood flow to where you're being active. For example, if you have just eaten, your body will often divert blood flow to your limbs and focus it at your digestive organs so you can digest all that food. Okay? If you've ever felt cold after you've eaten, that's why your blood flow is being diverted to your digestive organs. The way blood flow is diverted from one place to another in your body for periods of time is through sphincters. Sphincters are little circular muscles, and they are around near the capillaries. And if we want to shut off blood flow to these capillaries, these little sphincters will just tighten up and restrict blood flow. So the blood wouldn't be going to your hands. It would be diverted to your digestive organs. Okay? So just keep in mind that that's a possibility for blood. Okay? Now, we need to talk a bit about exchange when the blood is in the capillaries and the oxygen, for example, or other materials are diffusing across that capillary wall. Okay? If you'll remember the glomerulus in the nephron, a similar idea. Materials are forced out of the capillary due to blood pressure. So oxygen, for example, could get forced out due to blood pressure being so high in the artery end of the capillary. But when you get back when you proceed through to the vein side of the capillary, osmosis tends to be what allows waste materials to come back in to the blood vessel. Okay, so just keep in mind that pressure plays a role in pushing material out, but osmosis takes on the greater role when materials are flowing back into the capillaries. Okay. Okay. The lymph system, just so you've heard of it, is kind of a parallel system which kind of moves body fluids that are not contained in the blood around the body. The white blood cells move from different lymph glands around your body, and it's kind of a separate thing from the blood in the circulatory system, though it will return certain fluids to the blood. So just be aware. Normally they don't ask any questions about it, but that's what the lymph system is about. This is a diagram of mammalian circulation. It might benefit you to, Google a diagram or use this one and kind of make sure you understand the blood flow. Um, this one's got the, well, we'll address that in class if you need some help on it. I don't want to take the time now. We talked about valves in the veins. There are valves in the heart as well to prevent backflow into the heart. They're, again, like all valves, they're just flaps of kinetic tissue. There are two sets, an AV or atrioventricular. In other words, the AV is between the atrium here and the ventricle here. So this is the AV valve here. Here's one between the atrium, the left, and ventricle on the left, and that's the valve. Okay, so when you hear the beating heart, lub-dub, 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 what you're hearing are those valves closing and flapping together. A heart murmur is what you hear when the valve isn't quite doing what it's supposed to do. So these prevent, when the ventricle boom beats, the valves will prevent the blood from going back up there because they will close and the blood will be forced up into the blood vessels to go where it needs to go. The semilunar valves are simply between the ventricles and the arteries where the blood is going to flow. So if this is going to the lungs, this semilunar valve is going to prevent the blood from going back into the heart from this major artery. Okay, so semilunar, atrioventricle valves do all the same thing. They prevent backflow. Okay, all right. You should just be aware the heart also needs blood. It needs to be nourished, just like any other muscle. It's a huge muscle. So the blood vessels that nourish the heart muscle itself, are coronary arteries. So this blood vessel here nourishing the heart is a coronary artery. What this is showing is what bypass surgery might look like, where they take a blood vessel from another part of the body. If you have had a blockage in your heart, say right there, you might have a heart attack because this part of the blood vessel is getting blocked because you've got some sort of cholesterol blockage, some sort of plaque blockage in that vessel, and so you might have a heart attack and this part of your heart could die. However, if we take a blood vessel from another part of your body, stitch it here, stitch it there, and we are going to bypass that blockage. That's what heart bypass surgery is all about. Okay? All right, lub-dub, lub-dub, those are the sounds of the closing of the valves. Okay? So this is, the lub is when the AV valves are closed, and the dub is when the semilunar valves are closed. Okay? Heart murmurs are when there's a defect in the valve and it's not closing tight and some blood is getting through when it maybe shouldn't. The cardiac cycle has to do also with blood pressure and how they detect blood pressure. So a complete sequence of pumping is a cardiac cycle when the heart contracts and pumps and relaxes and the chambers fill. Okay, and then we go to a contraction again. That's a complete cycle. The contraction phase is when we have the highest pressure in the heart, the highest pressure because the ventricles are squeezing and pushing that blood out. So that is called the systolic, or the highest pressure. Okay? And when the heart is relaxed, there's no pumping, that is called the diastolic pressure, and that is the lowest pressure your body experiences, and that is when the atria are refilling with blood, and then we're going to pump again after that. Okay, so blood pressure is reported if you get your blood pressure taken. The systolic is over the diastolic, so the highest pressure over the lowest pressure that your body experiences. So for example, 110/70 is a common blood pressure. Okay, now the heart has to maintain a constant rate. Okay, how can it do that? Honestly, those little cardiac muscle cells are pretty weird things. They beat all on their own. You put them in a petri dish, 5 or 6, and this one will be beating ba-doom, ba-doom, doom, doom, and this will be beating at a different pace, a different time. They won't be synced up, but if you leave them alone long enough, they'll actually get themselves in sync. But we like to have nervous system control over things. So we are going to unify the contraction of these independent cardiac cells with a patch of nerve cells that is within the heart itself, and it's called a pacemaker. If your pacemaker goes bad, you get an electronic pacemaker put into your heart. Okay? The proper name for the pacemaker is the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, saying where it's located, which I'll show you in a minute. The A is for the atrial wall, where it's found. So this is going to set the rate at which all the heart muscle cells contract. It's the master switch. Okay, it generates impulses, and then these impulses travel from the SA node out into the heart so that it has a unified contraction. All these cells are contracting together. So let me show you in this diagram. Here is the SA node up here in the wall of the atrium, the right atrium, and it will send an impulse. This impulse will cause the signals to travel through the walls of the atrium, where they will reach something called the AV node, because this is another node of nervous tissue. This impulse will fire and send the impulse to contract down through some nerve branches called bundle branches, and they will go into still smaller nerve fibers called Purkinje fibers, but causing a unified contraction, first of the atrial chambers, then of the ventricle chambers. So the SA node sends to the AV, sends to the bundle branches, sends to the Purkinje, and we get the unification of the atrium, unification of the ventricles. Okay. When you are looking at an EKG on TV or whatever, this is what they're measuring, is the signals at the SA and the AV nodes, those electrical currents. Okay? Okay. What things can affect your heartbeat? What can affect the rate that pacemaker is telling your heart to beat? Okay? Well, there are two opposing sets of nerves. If you remember, we talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic and all of that. There are two opposing sets of nerves. One that sets to speed up the heart, one that will slow it down and calm it down. Okay? And there we are. There's our terms, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Also, hormones can affect the heart rate as well. If you remember, we've talked about epinephrine or adrenaline. Remember, epinephrine is just the more proper term for adrenaline. I don't know why they had to change it, but okay, I'm not even sure how to spell that anymore. The fight or flight hormone, made in the adrenal glands, but will increase heart rate very fast and dramatically, because if you're secreting adrenaline, you figure you're running for your life, so we need energy. Temperature can affect heart rate. Exercise, of course, is going to increase heart rate. So all kinds of things can affect the rate at which that heart is going to beat. Okay, that's it, and thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.